There was a patient who never died. Or maybe he did, but his presence never left the hospital. His name was in the hospital records, yet his breathing never stopped. Introduction. In an old hospital on the outskirts of the city, time had buried many stories, but one legend refused to fade. There was a ward that remained locked at all times, its doors sealed with rust and caution. The hospital staff whispered about a patient who had died years ago, but was still seen wandering the halls. Some said his name was still in the records, yet no one remembered admitting him. The forgotten ward. Dr. James had always dismissed ghost stories as nothing more than superstition. As a man of science, he believed that everything had a logical explanation. But that belief was about to be tested in ways he never imagined. St. Mark's Hospital was old, too old. The walls carried whispers of the past, and the dimly lit corridors seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness. The hospital had one unspoken rule among the staff: stay away from Ward 13. James had heard the rumors. The nurses whispered about strange occurrences, flickering lights, distant voices, and a wheelchair that moved on its own. Some claimed they saw shadows lingering behind the frosted windows of Ward 13, even though it had been sealed for decades. One night, curiosity got the best of him. While reviewing patient records, he found an entry that sent a shiver down his spine. Patient number 099, deceased, 1987. That wasn't the unsettling part. The real horror was in the last recorded checkup. Vitals stable. Last examined, 2 days ago. James felt his heartbeat quicken. That was impossible. A dead patient couldn't have a recent medical entry. Determined to prove it was a clerical mistake, he decided to investigate. At midnight, while the hospital was eerily quiet, he made his way toward Ward 13. The corridor leading there felt colder than the rest of the building, and the silence was suffocating. The door was covered in dust and rusted shut, but he could still make out the warning painted in faded red letters. Do not enter. He hesitated for a moment, then reached for the handle. The moment his fingers touched the metal, the lights above him flickered violently. A sudden chill ran through the air, and a deep, distant creaking sound echoed down the hall. He turned around. A wheelchair stood at the end of the corridor. It hadn't been there before. Then it moved. No one was pushing it. No wind. No explanation. And then he heard it. A whisper. Low, rasping, and barely audible. Dr. James. His breath caught in his throat. Someone or something knew his name. The silent patient. James spent the next day convincing himself that what he had experienced was just exhaustion. A trick of the mind. He had been overworked, barely sleeping, and stress could cause hallucinations. That's what he told himself. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. During his rounds, he casually mentioned Ward 13 to the hospital janitor, Carl, one of the oldest staff members. The reaction was immediate. Carl's face went pale. He glanced around, lowering his voice. You don't want to talk about that, Doc, he muttered. Some things are better left alone. James pressed further, determined to get answers. What happened in that ward? Carl sighed, looking reluctant. But finally he spoke. A patient was brought in years ago. A John Doe. No family. No records. He was in a coma, but something was wrong with him. His vitals were unstable, but he wouldn't die. No matter what the doctors did, his body just kept functioning. James frowned. That doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense to them either, Carl said. Doctors tried to move him to another facility, but weird things started happening. Equipment failures. Staff getting sick. Some even disappeared. One day, the patient just stopped moving. No heartbeat. No breathing. They declared him dead. But his body never decayed. A chill crawled up James's spine. Carl's voice dropped to a whisper. They tried to get rid of him. They buried him, but the next morning, he was back in his bed. Same room. Same position. Like he never left. James swallowed hard. That's impossible. Carl gave him a grim look. That's why they sealed Ward 13. No one was allowed to open it again. James felt a cold sweat on his back. That night, he did something reckless. He took the master key and unlocked Ward 13. The door groaned open. Inside, dust floated in the stale air. The beds were still arranged neatly, as if waiting for patients who never arrived. The machines were covered in sheets, their screens dark. But in the center of the room, a single gurney, and on it, a body covered in a white sheet. James took a slow step forward. His fingers trembled as he reached out. He pulled the sheet back. The patient's face was pale, lifeless, but eerily preserved. Not a single sign of decay. His eyes were shut, lips slightly parted, as if he had just fallen asleep. Then, the eyes snapped open, and he smiled. The awakening. Dr. James stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. The patient, the corpse, was looking at him. The man's skin was cold, too pale to be alive. But his eyes, they weren't dead. They were watching, aware. And then, he smiled. James's instincts screamed at him to run, but his body refused to move. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with something unseen. The patient sat up slowly, his joints creaking as if he hadn't moved in years. "You finally came," the man whispered. His voice was dry, like wind through dead leaves. James's mouth went dry. Who are you?" The patient tilted his head. "You already know." James shook his head, stepping backward. "No. You're supposed to be dead." The man laughed softly, a hollow, chilling sound. "I was." His pale fingers gripped the edges of the gurney. "And yet here I am." The lights above flickered violently. Shadows twisted along the walls. The machines, though unplugged, came to life, their screens flashing unreadable symbols. A deep, cold whisper filled the air. James turned sharply, but there was no one else in the room. Then the patient moved off the gurney. James's heart pounded. He reached for his phone, his fingers trembling as he tried to call for help. No signal. The patient stepped forward, his bare feet silent against the cold hospital floor. "You shouldn't have opened the door, doctor." The shadows shifted. The temperature dropped even further. James's breath came out in a fog. The machines beeped frantically, the heart monitor showing an impossible rhythm. Patient number 099 was alive. James turned to flee, but the door was no longer there. The curse of Ward 13. James pounded on the wall where the door had been. Just a moment ago, it was there. Now, only solid concrete. His mind raced. This wasn't possible. The patient's voice came from behind him. "They tried to bury me, you know." James turned, pressing his back against the cold wall. The man was standing too close now. His eyes were dark, bottomless pits. "They put me in the ground," the patient continued, tilting his head. "But I woke up here. Again. And again. And again." James's breathing was shallow. "What are you?" The patient's smile widened, too wide. "I was the first." James swallowed hard. "The first what?" The patient stepped closer. "The first one they experimented on." The machines behind him beeped louder, erratic. James's mind reeled. "What experiments?" The patient chuckled. "Oh, doctor, you don't really think this hospital was just a hospital, do you?" James's stomach twisted. He had read about the hospital's past, whispers of illegal medical trials, classified government projects. "They were trying to cheat death," the patient said, his voice almost playful. "And they did. They made me." James clenched his fists. "Then why are you still here? Why not just die?" The patient's smile vanished. "They never let me." The shadows in the room moved. Dark figures slithered along the walls, taking shape, twisted, deformed faces. James realized they weren't just shadows. They were the others. The failed experiments. And they were waking up. The patient reached out, his ice-cold fingers brushing James's shoulder. "You let me out, doctor. Now you take my place." James's vision blurred. His body felt heavy. The whispers grew louder. And then darkness. The never-ending nightmare. James's eyes snapped open. He was lying on a gurney. He tried to move, but he couldn't. His arms were strapped down. Panic set in. He turned his head, struggling against the restraints. The room was identical to Ward 13, but clean, functional. Bright lights. The hum of machines. Doctors stood around him. Doctors in old uniforms. Their faces were blurred, their movements unnatural. One of them leaned down, holding a syringe. "He's stable," the doctor murmured. "Vitals are strong." James's heart pounded. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The doctor's face shifted, twisted into something familiar. James's stomach dropped. It was himself, an older version of him, wearing the same uniform, looking down at his own body. The realization hit him like ice. He hadn't freed the patient. He had become him. The straps tightened. The machines beeped faster. The last thing James saw was his own face, smiling too wide. And then, everything went dark. The end or the beginning?